the presentation started.
Neil, we're seeing rising numbers. Do you want to kick off?
That's good. I will kick off. I thought, Lee, that we were having a slide which sort of just the first slide. Is that not right? The one. All right. That says who I am. Okay. Here we go. So I'm going to start now, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar, Children and Young People's Mental Health in Wales, Where Next? This webinar has been organised by GovConnect, and it's sponsored, of course, by Bernardo's Cymru. And in welcoming you to this webinar on March the 16th, I'd like to mention that today is Young Carers Action Day. Now, in this webinar, we'll be addressing the vitally important topic of children's well-being and mental health, with the main focus being on how families and young people can be helped through the provision of clinical services, social interventions, and schools-based initiatives. And of course, the presentations and discussion will have a special emphasis on current thinking and current projects based here in Wales. Before examining what can be done to reduce the distress of young people and their families, it's worth considering the extent and seriousness of the issues that we're addressing. And I've been asked to provide a brief overview of the current situation regarding the mental health of children and young people. For many years, there's been disturbing evidence of high rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, and other mental health issues for children and young people. Furthermore, in the years before the pandemic, there was clear evidence of sharp increases in the prevalence of many of these conditions. So in 2018, the Royal College of Psychiatrists reported what they called an unprecedented increase in the prevalence of eating disorders in young people. And the NSPCC reported in the same year a 41% increase in children and young people admitted to A&E for self-harm in the previous 3 years. Also in that year, the Office of National Statistics reported that there had been a 67% increase in teenage suicides in the UK over the previous 7 years. And a major international survey of children's well-being conducted by the OECD found that British children were the unhappiest in the Western world. The following year, 2019, a large YouGov survey found that 20% of young people in the general population agreed with the statement that life is not worth living. And it was noted that this was twice the number who had responded in this way just 10 years earlier. Faced with such evidence, it's no wonder that leading commentators spoke of a growing crisis and suggested that something's going very wrong. Various factors were suggested as possibly contributing to the worsening situation, including increased stress, growing pressure, including academic pressure on children and young people, but also increased social comparison, especially with regard to body shape, physical attractiveness, and popularity, with social media, of course, often cited as a toxic influence. And then also involved perhaps was increased bullying. And again, social media were often identified as facilitating cyberbullying and inappropriate messaging. And the fact that stress and mental ill health had also been increasing in adults suggested that children might be becoming more anxious as a result of the well-established phenomenon of emotional contagion. It's very important to recognize that childhood distress and disorders are not equally distributed across all groups. And the evidence shows again and again that particular groups of children are much more vulnerable than others. Indeed, not only do such groups have especially high levels of distress and disorder, but they also tend to show the steepest rises over time. Groups repeatedly identified as being especially vulnerable include looked after children and care leavers, children from minority and marginalised groups, those identifying as LGBTQ+, children and young people with a disability, those with special educational needs, young carers, young offenders, children living in poverty, and of course those who have been exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences. As an example of the differential prevalence in vulnerable groups, I'll quote two findings from the University College London Millennium Cohort Study, which involves a sample of 19,000 people from across the UK who were born in Millennium Year in 2000. When they were surveyed at the age of 17, 24% reported that they had deliberately self-harmed in the past 12 months. A quarter of this general population of 17-year-olds had self-harmed deliberately in the past 12 months. But this figure was very much higher. It was 50% among young people who identified as LGBTQ+. The sample were also asked whether they'd ever attempted suicide. The question was, have you ever hurt yourself on purpose in an attempt to end your life? The figure for the population as a whole was very troubling, 7.4%. But for those who identified as LGBTQ+, it was 3 times this figure, at 22%. An extra cause for concern is the fact that many who experience mental health issues in childhood continue to have such problems in adulthood. We know that half of all adults with long-term mental health conditions have experienced serious psychological problems by the age of 14. There's clearly a very strong case to be made for early intervention, and this has been accepted by government bodies across the UK, including here in Wales. Early intervention makes good sense strategically and economically, with a very high return on investment. However, unfortunately, this awareness has rarely led to the provision of the resources that would be needed for effective and timely treatment. In 2018, the Children and Young People and Education Committee of the National Assembly for Wales produced a landmark report called Mind Over Matter that addressed the whole issue of child mental health in Wales. This report was characterised as a report on the step change needed in emotional and mental health support for children and young people in Wales. And in her summary as chair of the committee, Lynn Neagle, AM, said, "We need to help prevent and manage the emotional, behavioural and mental distress of an increasing number of our children and young people. The time has come," the report said, "to deliver timely and effective emotional and mental health support for our children and young people once and for all. We need to intervene much earlier to address the seeds of distress before they take root." So up to this point, I've sketched the situation as it was 4 years ago in 2018. And we can see that there was very great concern, very worrying trends, and the frequent use of the term crisis to describe the state of child mental health. But we also see in the National Assembly report a Welsh determination and vision of how we might implement a substantial increase in the provision and effectiveness of prevention and care through a range of mental health services, with schools playing a major role and with the necessary logistics ensuring integration and a whole system perspective. The report's clarion call for new ways of addressing the unprecedented mental health problems of children and young people is now even more important and even more urgent than it was when the report was published 4 years ago, because all the evidence points to the fact that since the onset of the pandemic, the situation has become significantly worse. There are widely varying estimates of the degree of impact of the pandemic on the mental health of children and young people, but there's a clear consensus that the adverse effects have been substantial. According to NHS Digital, the rate of mental disorders in 6 to 16-year-olds in 2018 was 1 in 9. And in 2021, after the pandemic had arrived, it had risen to 1 in 6 children, so a 50% increase. A survey by the charity Young Minds in 2021 found that 80% of young people said that the pandemic had made their mental health worse, and 2/3 felt that it would have a long-term effect on their mental health. And once again, there was evidence that the vulnerable groups I mentioned earlier had been particularly adversely affected by the pandemic. Of course, the major impact of the pandemic on the mental health of children and young people has placed huge extra demands on services that were already very seriously stretched, and in many cases had been operating with long waiting lists, sometimes measured not just in weeks and months, but in fact in years. In September 2021, the Royal College of Psychiatrists published a report with the heading "Record number of children and young people referred to mental health services as pandemic takes its toll." They reported that the number of referrals to secondary services had more than doubled in 12 months. In fact, it had gone up by 134%, while the number of crisis and emergency referrals had also increased, this time by 80%. NHS Digital reported that referrals to secondary mental health services for young people with eating disorders in 2020 increased by 40% in the year, and that the figure was now more than double that of just 3 years before. Assessments are still being made of the prevalence of long COVID in children who've tested positive for COVID, but a recent article in The Lancet suggested that the figure is probably around 12%. If this is the case, we can certainly expect a substantial further increase in the demand for services. We need to remember that most of the figures I've been quoting relate to children and young people who have serious mental health conditions and who might be given a formal diagnosis. However, these are only a proportion of children and young people who are seriously distressed, low in confidence, lonely, unhappy, and highly anxious. The Mind Over Matter report highlighted the fact that many children who wouldn't qualify for a formal diagnosis do need extra support, partly to help them with their immediate distress, but also because such distress can undermine their resilience and leave them vulnerable to the onset of serious mental health conditions. The report also recommended that everyone who works with children and young people should be trained in emotional and mental health awareness, and it emphasised the potential contribution to children's well-being that might come through the new curriculum for Wales, which has health and well-being as one of its key areas. In the words of the Assembly report, the new curriculum offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to embed well-being into children's lives. So in Wales, we have the framework and the impetus provided by the 2018 Assembly report. We were also the first country anywhere in the world to introduce legislation in the form of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and we have the development of the schools-based curriculum for Wales. All of these developments hold the promise that we in Wales are especially well placed to support the positive mental health of children and young people in our country. And of course, there are also many more mental health related interventions being developed and rolled out in Wales, some of which we'll be hearing about in the course of this webinar. So it's a pleasure now for me to introduce the next speaker, who is Liz Gregory. Liz Gregory is the joint head of services, psychological delivery services for children in the Aneurin Bevan University Health Board, and she's going to talk about a particular project which is called NEST. So over to Liz.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you for that stark reminder of why these issues need to be front and foremost in all of our minds. Can I have the first slide, please? So I'm going to be talking to you about the NIST framework. This is a framework that has been co-produced over the course of a year by the Together for Children and Young People programme. I am the chair of the Early Help and Enhanced Support work stream, which really was a piece of work that was developed following the Mind Over Matter report, and really speaks to what Neil has described in that step change and cultural shift to put the mental health and well-being of children and families at the heart of everything that services do. Can I have the next slide, please? So what is NIST? Well, it's a planning tool, as I say, to ensure that mental health and well-being is at the heart of all services and to create a whole system approach. And it's a tool that was developed through a journey of co-production, working with children and young people, parents and carers, and professionals from across all settings in health, education, social care, and the third sector. And I think we started on this journey right at the start of the pandemic in April 2020. And the virtual world, I think, meant that we were able to include so many views from across the whole of Wales much more easily than we might otherwise have been able to. And I often tell the story that we were joined by a parent during their work break who came into the staff room and dropped into a meeting. We were joined by a teacher from their caravan in West Wales who wanted to contribute to the discussion. All of these things were made much more easier to do in the pandemic, and there's not much that we can say about the pandemic that made life easier, but certainly I think it was a much more inclusive process, and the co-production journey, I think it's been totaled up 220 hours of co-production went into its development. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm going to share an animation now, which really tells you what the framework is all about.
A little bird has been spreading the word all about the NEST framework, a planning tool designed to help services make sure that mental health and well-being is at the heart of everything they do.
A little bird has been spreading the word all about the NEST
children,
framework,
young people, parents, carers, and their wider family and professionals to make sure they feel supported and get extra help if needed. Time was taken to talk to lots of people and listen to their ideas. It was agreed that nests were a good way of explaining what helps children of all ages to grow strong, aim high, and be the best they can be. This happens when their everyday relationships feel nurturing, empowering, safe, and trusted. Everyone's nest is unique, made up of the people who are closest to them, the things they enjoy and help them grow, their communities, and the places they go to in their day-to-day lives. Trusted adults play a vital part in a young person's nest. They can lift them when they are sad, encourage them to try new things, help them join in with others, and make them feel valued and cared for. This is the everyday magic that builds and maintains positive mental health and well-being. The NEST framework aims to organize services so that more people get to experience this everyday magic in their daily lives. It also aims to help children and young people feel a sense of belonging, which is so important to mental health and well-being, whether that is at home, in school, at a club, with friends, or in their community. And when things aren't going well, like when a child or a young person is feeling sad, anxious, left out, or so angry that they push people away, the trusted adults who know them best will have access to support, giving them lots of ideas to try and the confidence to keep helping. That's because sometimes what a young person needs most is for trusted adults not to give up. NEST recognizes how important trusted adults are. When they are well supported, it can make all the difference. Sometimes, of course, extra help is needed, and the NEST framework's no wrong door approach recognizes that everyone is different and there should be lots of different types of help available. That way, all services come together to work out who can best meet the unique needs of each person. This makes sure children and families aren't bounced around services and gives access to the right help at the right time in the right way for them. We all need different kinds of help at different times along the way. The NEST framework aims to support children of all ages, parents, carers, their wider families, and the professionals who help them. It's about making sure everyone has opportunities that are nurturing, empowering, safe, and trusted. Learn more about NEST today.
Liz, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So there are 3 documents that support the framework. One is called the Bird's Eye View, and that's a very accessible version with images to support it for children, young people, and parents and carers, and anyone who just wants to dip into it. Then there's a document called What You Need to Know, which goes into more detail. And then there's a much longer document called If You Need to Know More, and that talks about the evidence base and the rationale, the co-production journey, and goes into each and every element of the framework in much more detail. I'm just going to talk you through the headlines. So at the centre, we've got the co-produced image. And again, young people were very clear that they didn't want something that captured them at a particular point in time or their family that looked in a particular way, but rather something that really reinforced the idea that this framework is for everybody, that we are all part of our communities, we all have mental health and well-being, and we all need to feel nurtured and supported to be the best versions of ourselves. And that's the people providing services as much as the people who are benefiting from services. And so this idea of the layers of support we all need to be the best that we can be was the image that was co-produced to demonstrate that. Then we've got the circle on the inside there that really speaks to the core elements that need to run through all children's services if we're going to empower people to have the best possible start in life. So we've got the rights-based approach, and I'm delighted that our Children's Commissioner is going to be speaking at this event also. And this is really the fundamental foundation of good mental health and well-being. And connected to that, of course, equity, diversity and inclusion. And the video really speaks to that sense of belonging that is so crucial to our mental health and well-being. Then we've got values-led, and this is really about that shift away from a deficit model and a disorder model of mental health towards looking at a strengths-based approach. So what's strong rather than what's wrong, and how can we support difference rather than disorder, particularly around issues of disability and neurodiversity. Then we've got child development, so recognising that children develop across a number of domains at a very unique rate, and how can we move towards understanding that rather than the cliff edges that the age-based service provision tends to reinforce. And again, those gaps that children fall through that Neil referred to from the Mind Over Matter report. And then we've got psychologically informed, recognising that, of course, there is a strong evidence base for individual interventions, but actually we know a huge amount from the evidence base about the culture and environment and qualities that bring out the best in all of us, whether that's in institutions, schools, homes, colleges, or generally in our communities. Then we've got the 6 domains that, again, co-production really identified, and Neil spoke about Wales being in a particularly strong position when it comes to education with the new curriculum, which puts mental health and well-being front and centre. We've also got the whole school approach, statutory framework, which really talks about the culture of schools and the well-being of teachers and staff, as well as parents and carers, and how all of these things come together to maximise the potential for children and young people, and that's early years settings, schools and college settings as well. Then we've got co-produced innovations, and as I say, the framework itself was co-produced, but co-production runs through all aspects of the framework, and that really is about listening to children, young people, parents and carers about what makes the biggest difference for them, and making sure that feedback loop is built into services at a strategic, organisational and individual level. Then we've got easy access to expertise. This is really about bringing that expert position much more into accessible ways of getting that information out there. So that might be training, information and advice, consultation lines, right through to mental health professionals actually being embedded in community settings. Then we've got safe and supportive communities. And this is really recognising that unless children feel that they're safe in their homes, in their communities, that they've got access to green space, to play, to sleep, to healthy food, to leisure, to arts, to sports that are inclusive, then their mental health and well-being is going to be compromised. So again, this is really about supporting our communities to provide the nurturing and supportive environments to help our children to thrive. And then we've got No Wrong Door. And again, I'm really delighted that the Children's Commissioner will be here talking about this. But No Wrong Door is again a kind of landmark document that really speaks to children and families getting the right support at the right time and moving away from this historical passing from pillar to post that families can experience, that they might be referred to a service, waiting a long queue, and then find out if that's not the right service for them, or past, chunks of children's needs being carved up and passed around services. And we've got some great examples across Wales where No Wrong Door is being put into practice. The single point of access or the space panels in Gwent is one example where services that provide emotional and wellbeing support from across health, education, social care and the third sector all come together and listen to the need that a family presents with and work out which service is best placed to meet that need, rather than whether they do or don't meet a type criteria. And then we've got trusted adults, and hopefully that came across really strongly in the animation, that trusted adults are at the heart and centre of supporting children's mental health and well-being. Then around the outside, we've got who's responsible for this? Well, it's all of us, parents and carers, children and young people, health, social care, the third sector and education. And we've got the co-produced nurturing, empowering, safe and trusted, the qualities that need to run through all of our services. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we get asked a lot is where to start. And what we talk about is that there's the macro, meso and micro elements of NEST, and all of them are equally important and they all need to come together. Next slide, please. Often we hear about turning the tanker in children's services, that we're so institutionalised and bureaucratic in how we do things, but we rather prefer to think about it as a flotilla. And actually there's lots and lots of really good work going on in Wales that speaks to the NEST framework and reflects practice in this area. And as Neil was describing, we've got some really big liners in the ocean, landmark documentation and policy and strategy to really support working and moving in this direction. Next slide, please. It's obviously much easier to start from scratch when you're designing a service, and the framework talks you through all the elements, particularly when new funding comes in at a partnership level, how to put this into place. Next slide, please. But there's also ways of doing things differently, and we again have got some lovely examples in Wales where people are coming together from across partnership agencies and starting to think about how they can work together differently. Next slide. And there's some really easy wins, and this is an example where some funding at the end of the financial year came in, and a range of professionals from across a range of agencies were able to take part in training for the Circle of Security training, which really reflects the principles of the framework, and they were able to access this training for free if they committed then to delivering Circle of Security groups for parents in partnership. So some lovely examples where joining resources and learning to work together can really pay off. Next slide, please. So I guess at the heart of this is that it's not rocket science, but there are some basic principles that we can ask in service design to ensure that they fit with the principles of NEST. So are children and families at the heart? Has it been co-produced? Is that feedback loop of continuous improvement built in? Are they developed in response to need? Do they fit with no wrong door? Are there flexible boundaries so that the needs of families can be met rather than if they fit with a very tight criteria? Are they developed in partnership, maximising our potential joint resource? Are they creative, innovative, reflective, and continuously improving? Do they take the whole family and the whole context into account? And are they nurturing, empowering, safe and trusted? Next slide, please. So that's all I wanted to say in respect of the NEST framework, and you can contact any of us on these email addresses if you want to know more. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Liz, very much for that. I think because of time, we will go swiftly on to the next speaker. And I'm very pleased to introduce Sally Holland, who, of course, is the Children's Commissioner for Wales. And we've already seen how the Mind Over Matter report has been so sort of key in terms of really settling, issues to do with child mental health in Wales and so on. And actually, both Liz and Sally were sort of major contributors to the sort of input into producing that report and so on. So great pleasure now to introduce Sally, who's going to be talking about No Wrong Door, the report that she wrote, bringing services together to meet children's needs. Sally. Sally, I think you need your microphone on.
Rookie mistake, we should know by now, shouldn't we? Prynhawn da pawb, mae'n hyfryd i gyda chi gyd heddiw, not heno yet. It's lovely to be with you all today. Neil set out the challenges that we're facing in supporting our children and young people's mental health and well-being at the beginning of this conference. And Liz has moved us on with our wonderful vision, really, as to where we want to get to in Wales. And the NEST NEATH model is one where, which gives me great hope as Children's Commissioner for our children in Wales, especially the fact because every region in Wales has signed up to this model and is on the journey towards working towards it. I'm going to try in the next 15 minutes to give you a bit of an insight into the journey towards NEST, where I think we've got to in Wales, both positives and negatives, and continued challenges. Could I have my slides up, please? Thank you. So as Neil helpfully, but maybe slightly anxiety provoking for some of us set out, the pandemic has sort of increased some of the challenges that our children are facing. As Children's Commissioner, I knew straight away when the pandemic started that in times of national emergency, our human rights, both children and adults, can be an element of society which is most at risk. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, my team and I decided that it would be really important to log children's experiences and views in this unprecedented, that was an overused word at the time, wasn't it? But just completely mind-blowing situation that we were all suddenly in. I'm proud to say that we actually managed to do what we think was the largest survey in the world of children's experiences in the first lockdown in May 2020, with more than 1 in 20 children taking part. And we repeated that in the second lockdown in January 2021. And these were our main aims during the pandemic. And we wanted to make sure that children, people and their families had really reliable advice, because it was a very uncertain time with it. So we did that through our information hub. And we wanted to make sure that the more vulnerable groups of children were getting support. And we did that in all sorts of ways I don't have time to mention today. But the third and fourth are related to the survey I've just been talking about, the Coronavirus and Me survey. Which made sure that children were heard and listened to. And then we worked hard to make sure that we responded to that, and that we continue to respond to that. The pandemic itself isn't over, and certainly the impact on children is not over. And, what we found was that it had a lockdown, and the pandemic as a whole had a differential impact on children. Some actually said that they found life better because they were taken out of their everyday stresses, and bullying, the busyness of school and everyday life, which was an insight in itself. But many children struggled with loneliness, lack of routine, and lack of the everyday support that many adults outside of the home give them on an everyday basis. And what we found was that, unsurprisingly, reported moods and feelings about life were much lower in the second lockdown. I think they were for all of us in that dark, cold January compared to the sunny May at the beginning. But it had a big impact on our young people, and particularly worries about what next, how long it would go on, and what impact it would have on their lives and their ability to gain qualifications and their futures. So I don't think we can underestimate the impact of the pandemic, although my strong message to children and young people has been, you're not a lost generation. You're a generation that's extraordinary. You've been through experiences that none of us had when we were young, and you've learned a lot. You've gained new skills that you often don't gain till you're much older, like independent studying and learning, and you should be proud as well of what you've achieved and done, and that most importantly we've got your backs. And that's what's a really important message for our children and young people to hear now, that we've got their backs. We're here to support them, and they're going to need a lot of support in the long term. Now, just before the pandemic hit, my team and I had started on a project. It wasn't called No Wrong Door at the time. It became that, because that's what we realised what was needed after we'd done the project. But we visited every region in Wales, they're called regional partnership boards, to see how well health and social care and other local authority services and the third sector were working together to make sure our children's most complex needs were being met. And that included a big focus on mental health and well-being, although that weren't the only needs that we were looking at. And the reason that we really felt this was important was because of the situations that children and families contacting our office were telling us that they were finding themselves in. So, for example, children and young people were sitting on waiting lists for a long time for mental health services, only to be told when they got there that they didn't meet the thresholds, and so no service was being offered at all to them. Children and their families were knocking on lots of different doors and being told that their problems didn't fit with any of the services that were on offer. And children were being told they had too many problems. So children who are neurodiverse in some way or another, ADHD or autism, for example, but also had mental health clinical needs, and we're being told, we can't sort of deal with all that at once. You're going to have to wait in this queue and then go back to your GP and get in another queue for the other issue. And for children with the most extensive needs, we were coming across children who were being told they didn't meet the thresholds for inpatient psychiatric care, but children couldn't live safely at home. But children's homes and foster carers and those supporting them in those places were saying, we feel their mental health situation is too severe, we need help with it. And those children were being told, you don't fit anywhere. So there's a lot to be worked out. And what we found when we visited all the regions in 2019, there was lots of good work, as we know, going on by lots of agencies, but little strategic overview, little strategic thinking about what are the pathways of these children? Why are so many falling away at different points and knocking on all the wrong doors, or being told that they're knocking on all the wrong doors? The regions were actually not looking at children's issues much at all. They were mainly looking at older people's care and adult care. Children's issues were marginal. In many areas, they said, oh, talking to you is the most we've ever talked about children as a group. And there were very few mechanisms to listen to children and young people and their families to be part of co-producing services. And there were lots of frustrations both ways between health and social care services and other services. There were some exceptions. We've already heard about Gwent's space and wellbeing panels. They were already up and running, and they've come a long way since then as well to fine-tune what they're doing, especially including neurodiverse children. But we said at the end of that report, we need to have a no wrong door approach in Wales. We need to make sure that we hold our children and families when they need extra support. We guide them to the right door. We bring the right people together, and we stop telling them they've got the wrong problems, or that their problems aren't severe enough, or that they're the wrong types. So we went back. Oh, sorry, I think I have explained what I mean by no wrong door. I'm not keeping up with my slides aren't keeping up with me. Sorry, that's my fault. But these are what children said they wanted, and that help should come to you. You don't need to keep coming to them. You should ask once and never be turned away, and so on and so forth. And we recommended that all regions, that's regional partnership boards, should plan and implement a no wrong door approach. And that means they should integrate things. There's not one way to do it, but they should integrate things. They should have panel models like in Gwent, drop-in centres, anything that makes services more joined up and easier to get to. So we've been back, and last week we published a report to say what progress we thought was being made. So where do we think things are at? Well, this is what we found. There's some really good news. Every region now has a plan to work towards a no wrong door approach. That's a huge step on to where they were 2 years ago. And remember that all of these services have been dealing with a pandemic in the meantime. So it was particularly impressive. All now have structures or groups dedicated to children's issues. I was at the launch of the North Wales one last night, for example, where they've come leaps and bounds in that huge region of bringing together young people, families, and people representing all services to have a coherent vision for where they want to get to, that meets the no wrong door challenge. Many areas are developing drop-in centres or sanctuaries for children in crisis, or just who need extra support with healthcare. And several of our crisis teams, most of our crisis teams, are expanding to be either open at weekends or even 24 hours open. And again, that's a huge step forward, because of course crises are much worse and often much more to peak at 11 at night or at 1 in the morning or on a Saturday, not 9 to 5 Monday to Friday as services have been open before. And I'm pleased to say that in response to my calls, the government has funded 6 regional centres that provide therapeutic accommodation for children with complex needs. Those children who weren't quite fitting to inpatient psychiatric care, but needed more support than children's homes or foster care could offer. None of them are open yet, by the way, but they're coming along. And pretty well every region had developed new ways of involving children and young people and co-producing plans with them. As you would expect, there are still some barriers there. challenges along the way. And I have to say, in no region will we be finding, would you find no children who are not experiencing the issue of knocking on doors and being told there's nothing for you or we can't help. And even in some of the ones that are most progressed in these areas. So it's a big issue that for children who need the most support is that, you know, funding is such a difficulty for our public services that, you know, they do end up getting in a real scrabble over how things are going to be funded and paid for. I think we just need to agree some simple formulas around this, by the way, or just pool the funding. In some areas, the pandemic has led to such high demand on services. I mean, a huge increase in referrals, a real issue with workforce and getting workforce to respond, that unfortunately waiting lists that had gone right down before the pandemic have really hit all-time new peaks in some areas, but not all. And we're still seeing that issue of children who are neurodivergent in some way with various autism spectrum issues, still being told often, you know, actually, you know, you need to wait in one queue to help with this one thing and the other queue for help with the other. So, you know, we really want to see things moving forward. The NEST framework is the way to do that, and the No Wrong Door approach, as Liz explained, fits beautifully within that NEST framework. You know, we need to make sure that, you know, while children are waiting for clinical assessments where that's the right thing for them, that we are providing these support. They shouldn't need a diagnosis to get the support they need. We need to make sure that we have true multi-agency approach to the right help first time, so that families don't get lost in systems. We need to boldly, jointly commission services and not be scrabbling, you know, fighting things out between services about who's responsible for what. And our neurodiversity, which we see as a key challenge to get this right, we need to make sure things are needs-led, not diagnosis-led. So we as a team will continue to monitor progress towards a No Wrong Door support with approach with a focus on support for neurodivergent children. And we'll be keeping a close eye on how the NEST or NEAth framework is being delivered, as we all will, I think, on this call. And, you know, really wanting to as well, not just monitor, we never just wag our fingers as an office, but be there alongside, supporting everyone to get this right. If we get this right in Wales, we will be, you know, world leading, it will be visionary. It's just, you know, I think we've got the right vision. We just need to all absolutely push so hard to get there. I do believe the will is there right across our public services, our voluntary and statutory sectors. And, you know, our children are there ready to roll up their sleeves and plan services with us. But we just all need to not take our eye off the ball and get there, because as we've heard so starkly today, the need is greater than ever. So this is how to contact me if you want to know more. I will pop in the chat as the afternoon goes on some links to some of those reports. Diolch yn fawr am yr wrando. Thank you very much for listening. It's your turn.
Sorry, you're on mute. Yeah.
Gracious, I thought I'd switch myself. Oh, there we go. We're all doing it today. Yes, so thank you very much, Sally. And we have a little time for discussion. And I mean, one thing just to start, that, I mean, I think you've mentioned the fact that, you know, resources are scarce, both in terms of, you know, people available, as it were, but also in terms of, you know, just the amount of money that are needed to run services. And I wonder how much you think of the No Closed Door as being it's obviously about logistics. It's about getting the machine working effectively and efficiently and so on. But I wonder whether, you know, a shortage of resources is going to sort of, you know, hold back the effectiveness of that. How do you feel about that? I'm sorry. I think you're mute now, Sally.
We should all know by now, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we should, shouldn't we?
It's just a slightly different platform for us all. Yeah, it is a real challenge because it's actually, we do need more money. We definitely need more money in the system. There's no doubt about that, but it's not as simple as just throwing more money into the system. We need a proper workforce strategy. We need to make sure we're getting the right people into the workforce, you know, at the right levels, and making sure that we're not seeing just clinical assessments as the only way of supporting and helping mental health and well-being. So I think, you know, I've concentrated a lot on the kind of mechanisms behind this, which is deadly dull, of course, to lots of people, but it is really important that we have proper mechanisms. So we have these structures in every region where they actually come together and plan things together. And, you know, what I've been really encouraging our regions to do is to just keep going back to individual experiences. So make sure they're constantly hearing from children and their families that support them, whether that's looking at specific case studies or hearing from groups to say, you know, well, if that's not working out, how will what we're putting in place, will that make a difference? If not, we're going to have to keep readjusting our plans. So it's partly, a lot of it's about resources, but it is also partly about really that sort of quite detailed, quite boring actually, mapping and making sure that the governance structures are there and people are, we're using all those precious resources in the best way.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Sarah, were you indicating that you'd like to say something about that?
No, Neil, I'm great with it. I just think it's brilliant that we'll go on in the rest of the session to look at some examples of where we're trying to fit it into a kind of no wrong door approach and a NEST framework kind of delivery. So I think people can look forward to that later on in the session.
Yeah. And how about you, Liz? I mean, you know, what are your feelings about the resource issue, the resource shortage, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously resources and more resources would be helpful. But what I do think is that no wrong door or that single point of access allows that maximising of potential of resources. And it also allows that meta perspective, so you can actually see where the gaps are, rather than, I think, historically, if one service had a long waiting list, regardless of what the queue was for and whether the needs got met, then more resources were poured into that. So that, you know, to stand back, look at the need, hear from children and families what makes a difference for them and where the gaps are, is the best way of then using whatever resources come into the system.
I mean, I don't know what the resource increases are in, I mean, across the UK or in Wales about this, but I mean, we know that the epidemiology is quite clear that post-pandemic, it looks as if there's been something like overall a 50% increase in diagnosed mental illness of children, which would suggest that, you know, we need a funding increase which is proportional to that and so on. And I don't know that that's happening. Sally?
I can perhaps say something about that. I mean, I think the big push has been on funding for education, actually, rather than our mental health services post-pandemic. But some of that funding, particularly in Wales, will support this effort because it is funding going into the whole school approach to mental health and well-being. I've been looking carefully at the funding on this, and at a UK level, Wales holds up quite well in terms of post-pandemic recovery. We're probably funding more per head in terms of the education recovery, which, as I say, encompasses quite a lot of wellbeing services than the rest of the UK. But internationally, we pale into insignificance compared to some other nations. So the Netherlands is funding about 5 times our level, and the USA is also funding, you know, several times more per head per child in terms of education recovery. You know, it was very before the pandemic struck, there was a real sense that, you know, there wasn't any more public service money. You know, there's no point in asking for much more because there just wasn't money. And then we've seen how much money has had to go into supporting the pandemic. And it just makes us think, you know, perhaps we just need a bit of a mental shift to think, you know, we will spend as a nation on our population. And, you know, my big plea is, you know, we need to spend on children's services right across the board so that our children can really properly recover from this pandemic.
Yeah. And I mean, I think everybody signed up to the idea that early intervention makes very good sense. And there is a high, I mean, you know, and it's in government documents, including Welsh government documents, that, you know, there is a high return on investment for every pound you spend. You know, you get many more down the line, of course. You get much bigger saving. We need to invest in children, you know, for all sorts of reasons, and indeed in the well-being of children, because there's this relationship, isn't there, between the general well-being in child population and the mental health of children. And by shifting, I was always been impressed by some research that was done a few years ago that showed that just shifting the well-being one notch up would make such a difference in terms of overall mental health. You know, it shifts people out of the zone of needing, you know, special intervention and clinical care and so on. Yeah. Okay, we've had a few questions from people attending, and we have one here. For example, well, Joe Phillips is saying, "Are you going to collect?" I think that means qualitative data, not just numbers. And I guess that would be for Sally. I mean, I think you're excellent at really involving young people in, you know, the whole project and so on. And I would imagine you're very interested in their comments and, you know.
Absolutely, yes. So we started off with big surveys in the pandemic, partly because it was a way for us to, you know, very quickly reach a large number of children, but that was backed up throughout the pandemic with focus groups with children and young people of all backgrounds and discussions with them. I'm very lucky to have, just as I expect our services to have, I have a strategic group of young people to advise me, and that's about 50 young people from very diverse backgrounds around Wales who I meet with every month, who really give me that really strong feedback, you know, almost in real time as to how things have gone for them during the pandemic and how things are going now. And, you know, without them, I would be quite lost really, because they advise me, they hold me to account, and they give me a really good sense of the range of views and experiences of children across Wales, because there's no sense, of course, that all children think the same or have the same experiences, just like adults.
A question from Catherine Barker, which is, how can we avoid delayed diagnosis by a specialist because of long waiting lists? And comments that too often people are fearful to intervene without there being a clinical assessment first, and so on. I guess one thing that, you know, people might think could be done to speed things up would be a sort of triage, really, where who needs to actually a diagnosis from a specialist, and maybe other people where that's not so needed, in terms of waiting, that delay thing. Don't know if that's, because I mean, triage is quite an effective intervention for speeding things up. It's a good logistic, isn't it, to actually separate at that level.
I mean, Neil, I would say we're doing this in line with CAM's teams, local authorities, either through early help hubs in Cardiff and the Vale, or in North Wales through our partnerships with Health Board and others. So I think there are elements of it happening, but it's not consistent, and it's not available to every child or young person in Wales at all.
Right. And there's a question that's come up. One or two people have raised this, and it's about resources. And it's the latest one is from Kelly Tam, which is, what's the role that innovative digital therapeutic approaches can play to support children early and in a targeted way at a younger age before difficulties escalate and become more complex? You know, is that part of the overall offering, as it were, resources that we actually make use of the digital? Yes,
it's certainly part of our blended delivery offer. Children and young people access things in different ways. Some like to access online digital therapeutic interventions, and others want to have them in person. And we always try and do that as Bernardo's, and I know many other providers do too, to have that flexible and appropriate offer. And again, that's part of the kind of no wrong door delivery, isn't it? To get it right for that young person. So we also do play therapy at a young age as well. So yeah, we do try and integrate that into our offers.
Yeah. And the thing I like about digital is that it can have huge reach with very little cost, actually. I mean, you can get out, in theory, to a lot of people. You don't need, a therapist per child, as it were, if you go digital and so on. And it's obviously only ever going to be part of the offer, but it's got a lot to offer. Okay, good. Well, it's 2 o'clock now, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who I see has joined us. So welcome Andy Bell, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Centre for Mental Health. And he has a long history of a special interest in equality in mental health, and was an important part of the Commission for Equality in Mental Health and so on. So that's, I think, the theme, equality and diversity. And so welcome, Andy Bell.
Thanks very much. It's always worrying when you're now described as having a long history of something I never used to be, but that's clearly something that's just happened, and I shall just have to accept and be brave about. Now, I've got some wee slides, and I think a colleague was going to do a magic thing with them, but if not, I will have a go at it myself, and we'll see what happens. Otherwise, I won't remember what to tell you, will I? And something is definitely happening, but it's happening rather slowly. So if you know what Centre for Mental Health is, well done. That's great. If you don't, we're an independent organisation. We work across the UK to eradicate inequalities in mental health, and we do that predominantly through research. But we also do a number of other things, including training and policy analysis and campaigning for change across a whole range of areas. The slides aren't coming up. I don't know if they're coming up for others, and I've just got this strange set of blue dots going in front of my eyes, but I definitely can't see them, so I'm just going to hope that they're working. There we go. They may be working. Let's hope so. We're also very, very lucky that we host the Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition, which has 200 plus members from organisations across the country that are dedicated to improving mental health for children and young people. Please do get involved if that's something that interests you. So I'm going to go through the basics. If you know lots about children's mental health, this is going to be a really boring 10 minutes. Go and make yourselves a cup of tea. But please do hang on, because what I'm going to be doing is sharing some of the research that either we've done or others have done that tries to get under the bonnet of what affects children's mental health in the first place. So I'm not going to talk much about services, if at all, but I'm going to talk about the risk and protective factors and what we can do to influence them in the best possible ways for children and young people. The way we start of this, and particularly when having conversations with young people, is to think of mental health as a spectrum. It's not a binary thing. You're either a person with or without mental health problems. We're all of us somewhere on a spectrum. We'll all of us be at different points in this spectrum at different times in our lives. And when we're supporting public mental health and better well-being for anybody, including children, we want to keep people down at the green and yellow end of this spectrum. And if people aren't there, we want to get them back to it. And that's it. That's all there is to it. If only it was that easy. What we also know from data is that across the country, rates of poor mental health among children and young people are growing. A lot of the data I'll share is for the UK. Some is for England. You'll just have to be brave about that. But I'm using the data that we've got that gives us the best possible picture and the best evidence. Some of it's international as well. What we've also seen is that the biggest rise over the last 20 years has been among young women and girls, and that if anything, boys' mental health, at least until the pandemic, was probably slightly improving. It's undoubtedly got worse again. What we also know is, on average, internationally, it takes 10 years between a child first experiencing difficulties with their mental health and getting access to treatment and support. That is an absurdly long time, a decade of delay. There's a number of reasons for that. We're not saying children are spending 10 years on an NHS waiting list. What we are saying is that there are a lot of missed opportunities from when difficulties are first experienced to when help is actually offered and indeed provided. So what do we know helps children to have good mental health? Because good mental health is something you can create. It's not merely a deficit where you're born with perfect mental health and your life takes it away from you. What we know is that there are things we can all do to help to give children the best possible start in life for their mental health. Having a strong parental attachment as a baby is really important. Positive parenting, living somewhere where you have enough money to live on, where you feel safe in your neighborhood, where you're housed securely, you have good social connections, and your school environment and indeed other environments you're in are positive and nurturing. Inevitably, the flip side of that is that all children also face risk factors to their mental health, some more than others. Many of the risk factors I put here on the slide, I shan't go through them in great detail, but they're all about ways in which power is exerted against children's wishes and against children's needs that cause harm and that have significant impacts on mental health, both immediately and longer term. And inevitably, this isn't equally distributed. We've all heard trite phrases about how any of us can have a mental health problem, and it is sort of true. But we also know the risks are not equally distributed, and there are many groups of children, not because of who they are, but because of the experience they have in life, that mean the balance between risk and protective factors is the wrong way around. There are many groups, I've only given some here, but you will know that particularly for children who are deprived or who experience adversity in their lives, those risk factors are much inflated compared to the things that can help to protect and promote good mental health for them. So here's an example of one of those inequalities. If you're a child from one of the poorest 20%, 1/5 of families, your chance by the time you leave primary school of having had a mental health difficulty are 4 times greater than a child born into one of the richest 1/5 of families. That's an extraordinary health inequality. We often think of inequalities as being kind of 10, 20, 30% or something. This is, well, it's a very big number. I don't know what it is a percent, but 4 times is very big, right? And here's a map of England, which I know is going to annoy you, but I'm showing it anyway, not for the detail, but because on one side, we've got a map showing areas of child poverty. And on the other side, we've got a map showing areas where rates of childhood mental health difficulty are greatest. The one thing I want you to take from this is the 2 maps are all almost identical. Just in case you weren't convinced by the point that poverty in particular is a major risk factor for poor mental health. So let's go through the different life stages and have a think about what might be affecting children and what can we do to help. We know the best place to help is the very first spark of life, and your mother's mental health, both when you're in the womb and in your early years of life, are both important to them, but also important to your chances of having good mental health. We know the vast majority of women who experience particularly common mental health difficulties during pregnancy or when they've got a new baby don't get any help. And we know that that's missing an opportunity to support both them and their baby and indeed other family members. Crucial thing here is identifying need and then providing support in a way which is actually helpful, which isn't stigmatizing, and allows women to get timely help and support for whatever they need. That may be a very simple thing, some practical help to manage the very difficult times they're going through, or it may be specialist treatment. For most women, it's not specialist treatment. It's about having access to talking therapy and some support. To do that, we need to make sure it's not stigmatized, and many women actually are afraid of saying that they're struggling with their mental health during this time for fear of their baby being taken away or being labelled a bad mother. So we need to make sure that that is done in a sensitive and thoughtful manner, as is the case with all mental health difficulties throughout life. As children then become toddlers and start to kind of find their way in the world, we know about the importance of healthy parenting styles. Think, if you can remember that back this far, to Super Nanny off the television. That's what we're talking about with positive parenting. And what we know here is that sadly for many children, early starting behavioural problems are a sign of poor well-being. And we know that this is linked with poor life chances throughout life, and so it's really important that parents are given the best chance of supporting their children to have a good chance in life, and that can be anything from support for the most vulnerable families, from home visiting, intensive home visiting, to access to a bit of advice and support with parenting techniques, and sometimes parenting programs. These are really well evidenced interventions, but they're very rarely provided at scale. School is probably the next most important place for mental health after your home you come from. And the thing about schools is they can bring about good mental health or poor mental health. They're going to have an impact one way or another. This isn't about adding more burdens to schools. This is about realizing that school is fundamentally important to your mental health. And of course, having mental health support available in schools is good, but it needs to be part of a whole school approach, really thinking across the whole organization about how good mental health is supported and how children have the best possible chance. Sadly, for many, school is a place that harms mental health through excessive academic pressures, through experiences of bullying, through being discriminated against. I'm sure anyone who saw the review of the appalling mistreatment of child Q this morning will know what discrimination is all about in schools, and experiencing those many inequalities and injustices that happen in school that chip away at young people's well-being. So crucially, we need a whole school approach. You can't just do one thing and expect everything else to fall into place. You've really got to thread it across the whole culture of the school. And that means including in behaviour policies. And this is a fundamentally important area, and where you'll be relieved to know I'm almost going to finish. We know that many children experience traumatic events. These numbers were from before the pandemic. And as a result of the pandemic, many more children have experienced traumatic events in their lives. Not all will go on to experience post-traumatic stress disorder or other mental health difficulties, but some will. And we know that's particularly the most vulnerable children are more likely to. And what we know is that punitive responses to children's behaviour within schools, if anything, go on to reinforce those difficulties, and it becomes a cycle of real trouble. So we really need to look at alternative ways in schools of supporting good behaviour, of dealing with bad behaviour, sanctioning bad behaviour, but doing it in a trauma-informed way that creates safety for everybody. One final thing, and then I'll shut up. We've been really lucky to work with a community in Birmingham of young black men, looking at what we can do in schools and indeed communities more broadly to support good mental health among a group of people who we know go on to have terrible outcomes as adults. We were lucky to co-produce a guide called This Is Me, which I've put on the slide here at the bottom, produced in partnership with young black men to talk about how they would like to be supported in schools to enjoy good mental health and indeed positive attainment as well. I'd really recommend it to you because I think it really helps to shine a light on the important things that can help to boost the mental health of a group of people who experience some of the biggest inequalities. At which point I am going to be quiet.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was incredibly informative and raised some very important, very interesting questions. I'm looking at I'm not sure that we have time really to address questions now. We'll leave that for a little while. Although I do notice that quite a lot of people have said about your presentation, Andy, and about other people's, will these slides be available and so on. And I believe that, in fact, the whole event will be filmed and will be available, and also that material will be made available to all those people attending. So I'd like to introduce now the next stage of our webinar, which actually includes some case studies of projects which are under the Barnardo's projects. And these have been, there are three quite brief pre-recorded case studies, the first of which is Beyond the Blue, which is a project which is based in Neath Port Talbot, and this provides a range of therapeutic interventions and counselling for young people and their parents. And this will be presented by Kelly and Hearn and Kath Hearn. Okay, we're ready for that.
Hello and welcome to our showcase on our service Beyond the Blue. I'm Kelly Ahern, Assistant Director, Children's Services for Western Bay.
And I'm Kath Ahern, Team Manager of Beyond the Blue.
Beyond the Blue is an emotional, mental health and bereavement support service commissioned by the Neath Port Talbot Think Family Partnership. We offer support to children, young people aged 5 to 25 years and their families who are experiencing mild to moderate mental health difficulties such as depression, anxiety, bullying, attachment difficulties, trauma, and families affected by separation and bereavement. We provide programmes of support ranging from emotional literacy, self-esteem and confidence building to managing overwhelming emotions such as anxiety and anger. We also offer counselling, play therapy, family relationship support when needed.
We receive referrals via the Early Intervention Panel, which is a multi-agency group who review the information and determine the best service placed to meet the needs of the child or young person. We work alongside the school-based counselling and wellbeing services in our area. However, these services are often in great demand and are sometimes limited to individual support, whereas we can provide family support when there are wider issues. So what support can we offer? We run a range of group support. Our Bright Stars group is for the under 11s, which focuses on building self-esteem, confidence and resilience and developing emotional literacy. Our #Happening group is aimed at 12 to 18-year-olds and explores emotional well-being, relationships, building resilience and coping skills. Our Reboot programme is a group for those young people identified as having specific challenges related to anxiety, especially helpful for those studying for their exams or who have additional pressures. We also run a group for parents. Our Build Me Up group is a 5-week programme which helps parents support their child's emotional development. We demonstrate some of the strategies and techniques that we use with the children in their interventions, so parents can effectively reinforce and increase the use of emotional literacy and positive communication at home. And we've been able to run these groups virtually for the past couple of years. Our individual interventions include emotional wellbeing support, counselling and play therapy, which can help address more complex issues. A lot of the children we see are not attending school regularly or find the stigma attached to identifying as having mental health issues or being in need of counselling as a real barrier to accessing these services. So Beyond the Blue is based at a community venue within the local YMCA, and we have a suite of counselling rooms where children, young people and families can access our services whilst blending in with all the other families attending sports and recreational facilities without any fear of being seen to be accessing a counselling service. We see a lot of young people who self-harm and or have suicidal thoughts and ideation because of feeling that they can't cope or they just don't seem to fit in. The impact of social media and the strive to be perfect and keep up with unrealistically high expectations on them is just too much. We also see a lot of young people who question their gender identity or sexuality, and even today face a lot of stigma and discrimination from family, friends, and lack feelings of acceptance or belonging. We've seen a significant rise in young people with eating problems and obsessive compulsive symptoms who may have become agoraphobic, and it can be a fear that they'll bump into someone they know or bump into strangers. And it's not just a lack of confidence, but a real fight, flight or freeze response that's being triggered in them, as if they were facing a real threat to their life. And this is where their anxiety really becomes debilitating, and it's very difficult to manage. Some of the cases we see are where children struggle emotionally when parents separate. Often parents are still in conflict with each other many years after separation, and children struggle with being the pawns in the middle, not wanting to choose sides and feeling torn by their loyalties and attachments to each parent and grandparents. The additional strain of living through the fear and isolation of the recent pandemic has placed even more layers of anxiety and disruption of young people's feelings of safety and future prospects. The light at the end of the tunnel is not visible to many of them yet. Whereas in 2018 we saw a fair proportion of children and young people presenting with anxiety and difficulty managing their emotions, we're now seeing almost every referral coming in where children and young people are regularly self-harming, have eating problems, are unable to attend school or college, and are experiencing despair and hopelessness. Many of these children will not meet the threshold for accessing CAM service, and only those significantly impacted in every area of their lives or who are at risk of immediate suicide or mental breakdown may receive that more intensive support. And even then, there can be long waiting lists.
The pandemic brought, as many of you here will know, a tremendous challenge to our service, and we needed to shift from in-person support to online delivery in a way that children and young people could easily access our service and maintain their engagement. No child or family had their support closed down during the pandemic. The quick transition of the service meant that we switched to online delivery without any compromise to our service offer. Pre-pandemic, we had a range of interventions on offer, most of which were time limited and targeting those with emerging needs. Over the last 2 years, we have seen that the increased difficulties that children and young people and their families are experiencing has had a greater impact on their well-being and mental health, and we have had to tailor and extend our support in order to be able to address these more complex issues and achieve positive outcomes. The collaborative relationship with our Commissioner has been central to our ability to respond to the changing needs of families. Monthly reporting has allowed us to closely monitor and track trends in referrals, allowing us to highlight increased demand and complexities. Through working in partnership with them, we have been able to secure additional funding this year to increase capacity of staff and therapeutic packages.
So, what outcomes can we achieve? Most of the feedback we receive from children and families say that after having support from Beyond the Blue, they're able to talk more about their feelings and have learned coping strategies to deal with difficult, overwhelming emotions. They are better able to deal with stress, focusing more on finding solutions than dwelling on the problems. They have a better understanding of the causes of anxiety and have learned better ways of managing it. They often find an improvement in the family's ability to communicate more effectively and compassionately with each other. Some parents report that their children are talking about their feelings more, and this has led to improved behaviour at home. Schools sometimes notice that children are using some of the strategies and techniques that they've learned, such as taking a time out and walking away instead of getting into fights all the time. Feeling listened to and understood is a common theme in the feedback we get, for example, after having received counselling. And feedback from our bereavement support can often be that they express having renewed hope for being able to move forward with their lives and create new memories, and that they can still have a bright future. Just one example from our bereavement service was a family that we supported with preparing for bereavement. This involved a mum who had terminal cancer, and the dad had a degenerative eye disorder, which meant a progressive loss of vision. Mum prepared videos and birthday and Christmas cards for her children to have throughout the forthcoming important events in their lives when she would not be with them. We supported the children to develop good emotional literacy and resilience through additional modes of expression, such as art, music and play therapy, in order to better prepare them for their loss.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with you today. If you'd like any further information, our contact details will be shared as part of the delegates pack. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation from Kelly and Kath. And now we're going on to the second of these three Barnardo's projects that we're going to be hearing about. Again, this is a pre-recorded presentation, and it's by Mania Williams-Jones.
Okay, thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr. Thank you for the opportunity today to be able to present to you our findings from our golau Ynys Môn service provision for children and young people with mental health and wellbeing issues on Anglesey in Ynys Môn. I will be talking a little bit in Welsh, but I will be repeating in English those elements as well. Felly ar y cychwyn, o'na cydnabyddiaeth bynafwlch yn arpariaeth iechyd meddwl a llesiant ar Ynys Môn. There was a recognition of a gap in health and wellbeing service and provision on Anglesey. Nathon ni mynd ymlaen I wneud ymgynghoriad archwiliadol gyda pobl proffesiynol, plant a phobl ifanc. So we explored and we did an exploratory consultation undertaken with professionals, children and young people from all the high schools and some primary school settings on Anglesey. Canlyniad o hynny oedd bwlch yn brig haen 2. We concluded there was an unmet need at the top of tier 2 provision. Nathon ni ymlaen wedyn I roi cais lottery fewn am £500,000 dros 3 blynedd, and we put a lottery bid in for £500,000 over a 3-year period. So we created a service that the children, young people and their families and professionals were telling us these were the issues that needed to be addressed. Felly welwch chi fyma, dyma rhai o'r syniadau ddath allan o hynny a nathon ni greu y gwasanaeth ar materion oedd yn sefyll allan o ran heini. It's important to note the intervention was on a one-to-one basis on a period of up to 12 weeks. Pwysig yn ganol hyn I gyd oedd cydgynhyrchu. So co-production was absolutely essential to what we were setting out to do. Here are the young people who helped us set up the service. Dyma bobl ifanc nath helpu ni. They co-created the service, they named the service with each letter of golau representing a factor or an element of the service. They shortlisted, they interviewed the staff, they created the referral forms and all our marketing materials, and they were absolutely central to everything we did. We did, however, note that we had to change what our service building looked like. So they went on to design the rooms, and here are examples of those rooms that they designed, one a bit more colourful and one a bit more therapeutic. And we looked at what was on our walls to make sure that when we discussed anything about mental health and well-being, it wasn't just about the negative elements. There is positive mental health and well-being issues we have to look at, and that we were not re-traumatising people coming through to our service. So their vision really was to have improved access of support for children and people with mental health and well-being issues through a bespoke service designed by them. Increased knowledge and awareness of emotional and mental health and well-being within partnerships to address the existing gaps in provision. A reduction of risk and unmet need for children and people experiencing mental health and well-being issues through the development of an appropriate prevention model to reduce the number of inappropriate referrals that were going through to CAMHS, and to pilot an evidence-based community model of delivery as an offer for future mental health and wellbeing services for children and young people. The model of intervention we based all this on was Daniel and Wassel's 6 domains of resilience. We had really experienced and skilled staff come through to the service who set about basing the interventions around these 6 domains. And if the 6 domains are positively in place for children and young people, then their resilience should increase. We also use the overarching seesaw framework that Barnardo's has in place, which is very much based on being child-directed, strengths-based, systems-focused, and outcome-focused, and making sure that the voice of the child, of the young person, is absolutely driving the way we work with them. This is some case feedback. This young person, the referral was received due to what was perceived to be negative behaviour within the home, as well as anxiety issues. So working with Golau has helped me understand the importance of good mental health. The positive things that have changed for me since working with Golau is my anxiety levels have decreased, how I look at my options and my happiness. I feel better than beforehand and have enjoyed the sessions. Another young person fed back. The reason for referral was anger, anxiety and low mood. I knew when the Golau worker was coming to see me, she was always on time. She was kind and sensitive and always easy to talk to. I am worrying less now. I self-soothe a lot more and I'm a lot more confident. I enjoyed the relaxing techniques. Here's a card from one of our youngest. So obviously the service went from 8 to 18 years old. And this is to thank one of the workers for the intervention. But this one, I think, speaks volumes. It's a poster, so they could feedback any way they wanted to, which says more of Barnardo's, more happy children. And Bernardo's is the saviour of the world, which I would like for that to be true, but obviously that's how much we meant to this young person. But more importantly is impact, and how we were measuring impact. That isn't just about the stories or the comments. So we filled in pre-intervention, during intervention, at the end of intervention, questionnaires to be able to measure the impact. So the strength and difficulty questionnaire, there was improvements in scores of 93% of participants, with a quarter showing significant impact, which is a drop of 7 or more in scores. We also used the young person's core questionnaire, drop in score showing positive impact for 95% of participants, with a quarter showing significant improvement, and that speaks volumes. Working in partnership was absolutely essential for the positive interventions for young people. Was working in partnership. And right from the beginning, we had a really good relationship with CAMS, and it was important that we worked out how to work together. So here's a quote from Ellen Sanderson. The opportunity of working collaboratively with Golai Project has allowed CAMS and Bernardo's to establish a purposeful working practice whereby children and young people could access mental health and wellbeing intervention and support at the right time and location, either early in the life of the child or the challenges experienced. The Bernardo's offer of an evidence-based model of intervention, which facilitates learning and development in relation to emotional resilience, is vital in addressing mental health inequalities for this generation of children and young people on Ynys Môn. And we have had a CAP independence evaluation undertaken. An interim report conclusion said the project outcomes relating to practice have been met and in certain instances exceeded. The service is implementing an exemplar model of co-production within its delivery of child and young person mental health interventions, which evidence suggests is not only innovative, but also requires high level of skills and fills previous unmet needs. A part of the service's achievements lie in the extensive collaborative working that has been undertaken and a clear definition of the boundaries of their work. The service has been successful in terms of appropriate referrals, filling gaps rather than replicating existing services, and putting children and young people at the heart of mental health intervention. And that is absolutely the whole ethos. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that presentation, which was very impressive, very uplifting, very positive indeed. And so we go on to the third of the presentations of the Bernardo's project, and this is from Headroom, and it's the first episode psychosis service, which is based in South Wales, and is a collaboration between Bernardo's and the Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. So if we can have that.
Hi, my name is Matt Brayford. I'm the clinical team lead for the Headroom Early Intervention Psychosis Service in Cardiff and the Vale University Health Board. Next slide, please. So when a young person experiences an episode of psychosis, they typically experience hallucinations and/or delusions alongside a cognitive deterioration. The majority of people who develop psychosis do so between the ages of 14 and 25 years of age. The impact that a psychotic episode can have on a person can be profound. A young person can go from having a functional life, perhaps being involved in education or employment, enjoying a social life, to being completely withdrawn from society in a short amount of time. The fact that this happens at such a crucial formative point of a young person's development means that the impact of psychosis can be lifelong, even if the person recovers. Young people with psychosis can miss out on achieving an education and early experiences of employment where confidence is often developed. Lifelong friendships and intimate relationships can be lost or even prevented from starting. Relationships with close family members can become strained, sometimes to the point of breaking down completely. When all of this is added together, you can see that a young person's life chances can be drastically affected by psychosis. Next slide, please. It's been recognised by a growing evidence base that the earlier people experiencing psychosis can be engaged in treatment, the better the prognosis and chances of recovery. Evidence-based guidelines provided by the National Institute for Clinical and Care Excellence, NICE, recommend that treatment needs to include much more than just medication. Early intervention psychosis services were set up to work intensively with young people as soon as psychosis can be identified to provide the full range of NICE recommended treatments and interventions. Alongside medication, this includes cognitive behavioural therapy, behavioural family therapy, psychoeducation, relapse planning, and support around education for loved ones, as well as more. We work to an assertive outreach model whereby we continue to work to engage people in any way we can, even when they don't want to engage. We understand that the impact of psychosis, psychosis can have, and understand that the last thing many young people want to do is engage with an organisation like ourselves. Next slide, please. So for this reason, we need to find imaginative ways to enable young people to have their needs met by our service. This is where our work with Barnardo's comes in. Our health workers, made up of doctors, nurses, social workers, occupational therapy and support workers, inevitably have to focus on symptoms and treatments often. The Barnardo staff, working alongside us, can put all of this off to one side and ask, what is important to you? What did you enjoy doing before you became unwell? And what would you like your future to look like? Most importantly, they can ask, what steps can we take now towards this? Next slide, please. So this role is much more important than just engagement, however. Barnardo's help the young person to develop confidence and the life skills they might otherwise have missed out on due to their psychosis. This can help to bridge the gap between our young people with psychosis and those who have not experienced psychosis. In terms of engagement, we found that when Barnardo's workers have gained the trust of a young person, they're often more likely to engage in other parts of the service, improving their chances of recovery. So to finish, evidence suggests that through using this model of working, we can prevent around 2/3 of young people from spending a life under the supervision of secondary mental health services and sporadic inpatient admissions over the long term. I'll hand over to Hayley. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. My name's Hayley Smith and I am the Children's Service Manager, and I look after the support workers within Barnardo's the service. So the success of our integration starts with good communication, and we've developed that on a multitude of levels, including between management and staff on the ground who work in a coordinated way. The staff are fully embedded into the multidisciplinary team meetings. They have access to a health service patient record system and also Barnardo's systems in terms of monitoring and managing data and information. There is good team coordination, communication, and co-working. So quite often there will be multiple members of the team working together with one young person so that there's a seamless transition of their care. There is regular team meetings and away days in addition to the multidisciplinary team meetings. And the hope is that staff are on the same page and that all of the services provided to the young people within Headroom are coordinated, they're responsive and they're creative approaches as well. And this service is continually evolving. The way in which Barnardo's workers work is quite detailed, but we recognise that quite often due to the illness, it needs to be adapted at times, or it may need to change. So it's a co-produced piece of work that happens between the worker and the young person, and this is managed over a 12-session model as opposed to a 12-week model, which gives time for the young person to develop a trusting relationship with their support worker, to identify areas of their life where they may want to attach a goal, and then they can begin the work together to focus on achieving some improvement, some level of improvement. This could be around their daily living, i.e. doing tasks or everyday things, writing letters, organising their routines. But it can also be around accessing community provision and resources, joining clubs and gyms, libraries, and that's as far as also looking at the higher aspects of their attainments that they'd like to achieve, such as employment and training and education. And quite often the young people we work with are already in employment or training or higher education, but this support can sit alongside their journey wherever they are. So it can be responsive in as far as meeting those bespoke needs as and when needed and required. The team have learned a lot working in an integrated way. So the training and the formulations that happen at MDT enable us to have the ability to deliver those awareness raising sessions around psychosis to other professional teams of staff, which we've done on a regular basis. Some of the group work that we do has been quite dynamic and quite focused in improving the young person's physical health. And we have walk and talk groups where they do a bit of orienteering and a bit of, I was going to say gorge walking. It's not gorge walking. It's, I can't think of the word. Walking around places of interest, historical sites, coastal walk, that type of thing. But it also extends to families to a degree. There's already a successful family group being run by the clinical team alongside therapeutic support of CBT. But there are often times where on that day, in that moment, in that week, that a family might just not be coping too well. And quite often the Barnardo support worker will be available to sit with the family and sometimes work through some additional problems that might arise. We've got good links across the community, so we're able to involve young people in organised activities, but also help them find perhaps, you know, the most unusual activities they might want to be a part of. And as a result of our links, we've developed some really good partnerships, such as the British Transport Police have collected donations of musical equipment and run projects for us. We've been able to use community rooms and venues, and also access services that offer sports programs and additional things. And at the moment, I think they're involved in a community environmental project. So there's lots of offers and lots of options that we're able to bring into their life at a point where they might be ready to receive it. Thanks for listening.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Matt and Hayley. And I think those three presentations have been really very impressive indeed, and very, as I said, very uplifting, really important projects that are going on by Barnardo's here in Wales. So it's appropriate then that we come to our last speaker, who's actually Sarah Crawley, who is the director of Barnardo's Cymru. Over to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Neil. If you could pop my presentation up, that would be great. Thank you. So firstly, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers. It's a privilege for Barnardo's and Wales to have such a drive and determination and experience for us to get mental health and wellbeing right for children in Wales. Not only them, but their families, their carers and their guardians as well. So I want to just say, why Barnardo's? We can see here our extent to our reach and our size, 791 services, and this is across the UK, supporting in excess of 380,000 children and young people and families. But we also deliver specialist services as well. And so across the UK, we've actually have 76 children and young people's mental health services, supporting in excess of 48,000 children and young people. So you can see that's a very extensive reach. You've heard today from just some of our mental health and wellbeing services in Wales. And you've seen that they provide a collaborative, co-produced approach with children and young people fitting into the fabric and the system of the mental health support within our health boards, within our education system, and within our local authorities and communities. So this is really us trying to deliver the No Wrong Door alongside a NEST framework type approach. So what I wanted to just briefly cover was impact of the pandemic. I'm not really going to go through this because I honestly think Andy, Neil, Sally and Liz and others have covered the extent of the pandemic's impact on our children and young people and those shocking figures, and the fact that the pandemic has actually exacerbated existing conditions and is now exacerbating poverty. And with the crisis, cost of living crisis, we could well see greater levels of mental health and wellbeing issues within our communities, and particularly the link to deprivation. So we have a mental health system at the moment that we could put this in England, we could put it in Wales, but it does exploit and show the grave inequalities that exist that Andy mentioned and just showed starkly in his maps, that deprivation and mental health go hand in hand, and we must break that cycle and we must break that association. Too often, as we've seen from Sally's No Wrong Door report, there is late intervention, inappropriate intervention, and people left on waiting lists for far too long, not receiving the right services. But we do have burgeoning signs of the No Wrong Door approach being implemented. We have early help hubs that have come into place. You've seen how some of those are interacting with our services. We also, though, have continuing fragmentation. And so we need to be building a system that understands each other, communicates with each other, and works together alongside and within that NEST framework. There are barriers to reform. I'm quite fed up, I have to say, with people taking a financial view or a risk perspective and not actually putting the child at the centre of their mental health support and what provision they actually need. And so I would like to see no more conversations about the child or about the young person and about finances and who they should be supported by. It should just be, how will they be supported in the best way for their life and for their future? So what are we doing in Barnardo's? We are progressing towards becoming a much larger and more integrated health and social care charity. We've got 154 years of experience of helping the most vulnerable children and young people in our society. But what we want to be able to do is be part of those solutions into the future, particularly around mental health and wellbeing. So our health strategy will look to partner with organisations. It will look to produce the best outcomes. We have a vision of reducing and hopefully eradicating health inequalities, but we can't do that as a single organisation. We have to do it as a system. So what I wanted to finally say was, this is the outline approach that we'll be taking across Barnardo's. And when Neil mentioned earlier about digital mental health offers and a blended offer, we're going to be offering that across the majority of our services. We're going to be having a national approach to it, but also a localised access to assist children, young people and families with supporting their own mental health and resilience and being able to access services at the right time in the right way for them. We also can't see mental health in isolation. We deliver family support services, we deliver parenting services, we deliver young carers services, we deliver care leavers services. And as we've mentioned, and particularly Neil summarised in his opening speech, mental health is there for everyone. And actually, we need to be providing support into our other services as well and getting that right. So we've also got a Barnardo's virtual family hub that will be progressing and launching and evolving as these services develop. So we'll be taking an integrated mental health and wellbeing approach. We'll be taking a whole family approach where possible. We'll be working closely with educational establishments, health boards and local authorities and our commissioners. But what we'll also be doing, as Andy mentioned earlier, mental health can start pre-birth and post-birth, both for the parent and for the child. So we'll be looking at perinatal mental health prevention and early intervention and services right across the age spectrum from 0 to 25. And underlying that is an evidence-based approach to working with the whole family, because mental health isn't just in school, it isn't just for that young person, it's actually who supports them, who protects them, and who is that trusted adult. So our next steps will be embedding the NEST framework in Barnardo's delivery alongside other organisations and partners. We'll expand our whole family approach to mental health and wellbeing. We will liaise with education and health around the whole school approach and the implementation of the No Wrong Door. We will continue to co-produce with children and young people and to ensure that we implement the NEST framework. We've mentioned that we have lottery bids in at the moment, and we have 2 lottery bids that we're part of, which is Mind Our Futures bids. And those are a new way of the lottery developing co-producing services that implement and change the mental health and wellbeing system for children and young people in Wales. And finally, I want to assure you that we will continue to ensure children feel nurtured, safe, empowered and trusted. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for that. What I'd like to do is to pick up on one of the comments and one of the questions from one of the people attending. And I think it links to something that you said there about how important it was to work closely with educational establishments and so on. Barnardo's recognises that. And I guess and the question was from Nikki Jones, who said, how do schools find out about the various projects given the importance of school-based early interventions and family interventions? So I wonder, I think probably, the 3 or 4 of you have got something to say about that. Any offers on, how do schools know about this? It sounds like there's wonderful stuff going on, and it's too good to keep secret. How do schools get to know about it? Yes, Liz?
I don't mind kicking off, but I'm sure others have got much to contribute. I think one of the aims of the whole school approach is to think about a whole school and how it connects with the whole system. So it's really about linking schools with a connector outside of the school who's much more embedded in the No Wrong Door, the system of support that's available to a school, as well as really helping that school look at its own strengths and culture of the school. Because, we've heard lots of people say today that it's not just about interventions or services, it's about the whole culture and the well-being of the teachers, the support staff and the parents and carers. So I think the whole school approach aims to go kind of much further than school just being a vehicle for education, but rather a community hub that hosts and benefits from the resources that it's surrounded by. And we're really clear. I think teachers have had so much on their plate, and to then add mental health and wellbeing to the list is not how we see it, but rather if we've got happy, healthy children, they learn better and it's all connected. So really empowering that approach is what the whole school approach is all about.
Okay. Sally, did you have a comment about the school? How do schools get to know about these wonderful projects?
Well, back to my sort of obsession with structures, etc. I do think that at regional level, they are starting to do much more. The good news is starting to do much more mapping of what is there in their region, but also localities. And the regional partnership boards which are health and social care, local authorities and health coming together, are required to work with the voluntary sector as well, and with citizens and the adults and children to make sure that they are getting the right services in the right places. It's not quite there yet, I have to say, but there is much better mapping going on and identifying of gaps, and that's where then they start commissioning people like Barnardo's to come in and make sure the services are there. Also, Public Health Wales have been they've been doing it for some time. I'm not sure, Liz might know whether it's been published yet, but they've been working on providing documents which show what actually has evidence bases that schools should use, because that's really important, because schools are actually are bombarded all the time with glossy brochures of people saying, use our thing, it'll cost you a bit, but use our thing. And actually a lot of services are available for free to schools because they've been commissioned more broadly by government or by health boards or local authorities.
Okay, thanks for that. Andy, did you have a comment about integrating with schools?
Exactly what Sally just said, schools want to do something about children's mental health, or the majority do.
Yeah.
And it can be bemusing just seeing, you know, well, what do you do? Where do you start? And we know that individual interventions and projects could do more harm than good, or maybe completely ineffective. You know, if you go and do training in a school and then you go back to the same environment on Monday morning, don't expect anything to be any different.
Sure.
So it is about embedding it in the school, and it's really important that public health is supporting schools to bring that thinking in and to adopt that whole school approach, rather than just thinking it will happen because some people went on some training on a day off.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And Sarah, I mean, in a sense, you well, with other people, you've raised this issue. So how do Barnardo's work with schools?
We work very closely with schools. We do actually have an evidence-based program that we have provided to several schools, particularly in Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire area, and now in the Vale, and that's the Paths program, and that's for both early years and primary schools, and we've developed that package. But we also work closely with local authorities. They commission us commonly to deliver these services. They've identified gaps and issues. They're working their way through with regional partnership boards, the No Wrong Door approach, and the implementation of the NEST framework. And so actually, I would say a lot of schools should be approaching early help hubs, which exist in quite a few of the areas. I mean, Cardiff is a very, very good example of an early help hub where they'll triage children and young people into the right service at the right time, and whoever provides that most appropriately. But yeah.
And there's quite a lot of consensus, isn't there? I think we're all agreeing on a few things. One is that evidence-based is really important. I think we agreed on that one. That we need more resources. That's agreed. And also this, I mean, you know, one of the major themes, some speakers, has been the move from fragmentation to integration. It's about getting the machine working well-oiled and smoothly, the engineering of it, and so on and so on. And altogether, I mean, we started off really with some sort of grim figures, and they've come up several times, you know, and things are, you know, I don't know, maybe the pandemic effects will now become less, hopefully, but there seem to be other things on the horizon, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment on how we speak to children about war situation, and, you know, as well as climate and all the rest of it, and a lot of parents saying, I don't know how open to be and how much to discuss these things and so on. So, you know, we're not in a sort of happy place generally in terms of that environment, that ecology of, you know, what we're in and so on. Nevertheless, I think we've seen a lot of grounds for hope in the presentations today. We really have, and clearly there's a lot going on. And as I said earlier, I think that in Wales there are sort of special, you know, reasons to be cheerful, as it were, to coin a phrase, you know, because we do have the, you know, that model, the mind over matter, which everybody, I think, has sort of referred to in some way. And indeed, as I said, Liz and Sally actually contributed to that report. And so we've got that, and that provides a very good model, but we also have the wellbeing of future generations, and we have the new curriculum, which really does offer the prospect. And I mean, my personal hope is that it's actually not just going to be about you know, teaching children facts about health and facts about well-being, but it's actually going to skill them up. It's actually going to, you know, be an intervention in itself that actually helps children to be happier. Because happy children tend not to starve themselves, happy children tend not to cut themselves, and so on. So actually increasing positive mental health is a really a worthwhile thing to do, of course. Okay, good. I don't know if there are any final comments anybody wants to make. No, everybody's smiling and everybody's shaking their head. That's a good thing. Okay, so there we are. Thank you very much for attending. All the people who've attended. We had at one stage, I think it was 180 people. And thank you, of course, to all the speakers. And thank you for Barnardo's and also to GovConnect. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.